Hello and welcome to How To Automotive. In today's video, we're going to be working on all the engine and transmission mounts on a Ford Focus. This is 2011 through 2018 with the 2.0 liter engine. So stay tuned for that. So on this vehicle, we're replacing the mounts due to vibration. If you put it in gear with the engine running, you may feel a lot of vibration in the dash, and this is caused by the motor mounts breaking down. So there are three mounts on this vehicle: the main engine mount here, a torque mount below, and then underneath the airbox here is the transmission mount. I'm going to walk you through the steps for replacing all of those, and we're going to be using factory parts here, and I'll show you the part numbers. I'll link them up in the description if they're available. If not, check your local dealer. The first one was the torque or thrust mount. This one here is the transmission mount. This is what it looks like here. And then this next one is the main engine mount for the car. Like I said, all these links will be in the description of the video. If you're doing this at home, you're going to need to jack the front of the vehicle up. Use floor jacks and jack stands. You're going to jack it up on the pinch wheels over here on the side of the car. Let the suspension and all that hang down. And then you're going to crawl underneath the vehicle. Your vehicle is most likely going to have an undershield. This vehicle is missing, so you're going to go around the perimeter and remove the fasteners and remove the lower shield. So if you're doing it at home, you're going to need a good quality pair of jack stands, a floor jack, and a block of wood. Even if you're not doing it at home, you're going to need the jack and the block of wood. We're going to start with the easiest mount first, which is the torque mount or thrust mount here. It's right back here. I'm going to be using cordless power tools. You can do this all by hand. I'm using a 15mm socket with my walkie impact gun here. I will link this up in the description of the video. So you're going to run the bolt here in the back out, the two on the sides here. So I'll put the tools that I think will benefit you guys in the description of the video. That way, if you need to pick any of those up, you can find those links there. So the mount is loose, but we need to finish taking the bracket out. On the back side here are two more 15mm bolts. We're going to take these two fasteners out. I'm just using a ratcheting wrench here to get to these fasteners. So this one right here is pretty easy. The one up top is a little more difficult, and I'll show you how I got to that. So I went around on the opposite side over the top here to get to that fastener. And then you can crack these free and loosen them up. Once you get those bolts removed, now you can go ahead and pull the bracket out first, along with the motor mount or the torque mount here. Now when we go to install the new mount, we want to make sure that the threaded portion right here, the thicker part, faces towards the driver's side of the vehicle. So you're going to slide it in like this. Now we can take the attaching bracket here and slide it into the mount, and then start the three fasteners on the mount that mounts to the transmission here. So start these three bolts. Remember, these three bolts are different than the two bolts that went into the actual mount. So you want to keep track of all the bolts as you take it apart. So go ahead and start all these. We're going to leave them loose. We're just going to start them all by hand. Once we got all three of the bracket bolts started by hand, a few threads, and still loose, we're going to put the main bolt in here. It's got the thicker washer. So we're going to start that bolt now. So we run it up through the frame here and start the bolt into the mount. You may have to wiggle the mount left or right to get the bolt started. Now we can take this main bolt here that mounts the two brackets together. And as you can see, if you need to move the engine back and forth, you can do that to line it up. Go ahead and start that bolt. Now that all the bolts are started, I'm going to start back here in the back and just snug up the back bolt. Then I'm going to snug up the rest of the bolts in order here. I'm not torquing these down, I'm just running them until they're snug, and then we'll do it by hand. Now for torque wrench, I'm torquing the main bolt here with the thicker washer to 92 foot-pounds. If you don't have a torque wrench, it's a pretty tight fastener, so about as tight as you can get it with a 3/8 ratchet will get you in the ballpark. So now you can torque down the remaining four bolts at 59 foot-pounds. And that'll complete the installation of the torque mount. Now we're going to move on to the engine mount. To do the main engine mount, we're going to need a floor jack and a block of wood like I got here. You're going to want to have the front of the vehicle slightly jacked up off the ground. Now we're going to slide the floor jack underneath the vehicle, and we're going to place it on the bottom of the oil pan. We don't want to hit this metal bracket right here. We're going to go slightly to the right of that. So we're going to jack the floor jack up until it's just touching the oil pan here, and maybe give it like one little small pump to kind of release the pressure of the engine off the mount here. So maybe about a 1/2 inch or so, you're going to jack it up. We need to get this coolant reservoir out of the way because the mount's mounted underneath it. One of the things I like to do is take this little hard line here off. So squeeze the tabs and pull it off. The reason why I take it off is if we move this bottle out of the way, it can possibly break this hose. So we just want to take it off and leave it here. We're going to leave the lower hose connected. We're not going to drain the bottle or anything. And we're going to pull these little tabs up here on the back. The bottle basically lifts straight up vertical. So we're going to take the little tabs here and squeeze them and then pull this hose off. We're just going to leave it right here. We're not going to move it. After that, you can grab the bottle with both hands and lift straight up like this, and now you should be able to swing it out of the way, leave the lower hose connected so it doesn't drain. And now we have access to our engine mount. There's going to be a 15mm bolt on the left and the right side of the engine mount here that we're going to loosen up. So I'm just going to crack these free here with a breaker bar. Once you got the two 15mm loose, now we can take off the 18mm bolts right here. I just used an impact tool here to make it quick. Now you can finish removing the two bolts on the side here, on the left and the right side of the mount here. If the engine drops a little bit, go ahead and just pump up your jack a little bit and level the engine out. So once you got those four fasteners removed, now you can just lift the motor mount straight up and out. Now you can drop your new engine mount into place, exactly the way the old one came out. So slide it over the studs on the engine block and then start the bolts here. I like to start all the fasteners by hand, so I started the two bolts on the left and the right side here. After I got those started, then you go ahead and put the two nuts on the studs here, the 18mm nuts. Go ahead and start those. Now you can go ahead and run the 18mm nuts down and snug them up. We'll torque these down in a moment, but for right now, just run them down until they're snug. So if you feel like the engine moved left or right, you can go ahead and pump it up a little bit. That'll take a little bit of slack off the motor mount, and you can slightly move the engine left or right to help line it up. I like to use the old mount and look at the markings on it where the bolts made, and that way you can line the new mount up exactly the way the old mount was, so you can move the engine left or right and then tighten those bolts down in the exact same position, and then your motor will be centered. Once you got it lined up, you can lower the jack down. Now you can tighten the bolts up on the left and right side here, so you can run them down so they're snug. And after that, we're going to switch over to a torque wrench. The two bolts on the left and the right side of the mount, the 15mm, they're torqued down to 59 foot-pounds. So go ahead and torque each one of those down. Once you got the two 15mm bolts torqued down to 59 foot-pounds, you're going to switch over to the 18mm bolts here, and you're going to torque these down to 66 foot-pounds. Now you can flip the coolant reservoir back into position, line them up with the little tabs that they mounted on. They get on the left and the right side here. So you'll line them up and then press it down until it locks into position. Once you got it lined up, just press down, lock it in position. Now you can put this hose on and it just presses back on until those little clips on the left and right side of it clip onto the bottle. Now you can top off your fluid if it leaked out any. Mine leaked out an ounce or two while I was doing this, so I'm going to top this off. Now that we're done with the engine mount, we're going to slide the floor jack over to the transmission side with the block of wood. We're going to jack the transmission up slightly, about a 1/4 inch or so. This will support the transmission as we take the mount out. We need to take this air box and the battery out here. We're going to get started by removing the air cleaner assembly. We're going to loosen the air snorkel boot here, loosen the clamp up. Now that I got that clamp loose, I'm going to go ahead and pull the battery cover off and set this aside. Now the air cleaner has 4 bolts going around the perimeter of it, so there's 8mm bolts. We're going to use a little impact tool like this to remove these fasteners. To get to the bolts on the back side of the air cleaner, you may need an extension like this, and go ahead and remove these 4 bolts. Now you can lift the cover off and set this aside. You can pull the air filter off and set this aside as well. At the front of the box is an air snorkel. There's a little lever you're going to pull to flip this over, and now you can pull the air snorkel up and out. Now we can separate the mass airflow sensor here from the air snorkel. So go ahead and use a little screwdriver to help pry it off. Once you pull it off, then you can pull the mass airflow sensor and the air box assembly out. So you're going to pull that box straight up and out. The lower portion of the box is only held on with rubber grommets. There was also some wires clipped to the side of it, so I popped those off with a panel popping tool. Just put it behind it and give it a little twist and pop those off. As you can see here, I'm popping the attached wire loom off with the panel popping tool here. And then once I got that popped off, I was going to try to leave the mass air flow sensor plugged in and just flip the whole air box out of the way, but it was the wiring was a little too short. So what I went ahead and did was pop the wiring off right here and disconnect it from the box, and then unplug the mass airflow sensor. It has a little locking tab that you need to lift upwards, and then you can squeeze the tab to disconnect it. Now I can remove the air box. So now I'm just disconnecting any remaining wires connected to the battery box here. So we need to get this out of the way so we can get the battery and the battery box out of the way so we can get to the engine mount. So I'm just popping any remaining wire loom holders down. Now we're going to disconnect the battery cable here. Normally you would disconnect the negative one first, but it's tucked up under the firewall. So we're going to disconnect the positive here. And then what we're going to do is lift up here. This little portion of it slides into the air box. So you lift up and that'll detach it. Now you can remove the hold down bolts here, the two 10 millimeters on the left and the right side of the battery. Once you get the two fasteners holding the battery hold down, remove the two 10 millimeter bolts or nuts here. Now you can go ahead and just lift the bracket off and set this aside. Now you can lift the battery up and slide it forward, and then that gives you access to the battery cable in the back. So go ahead and remove that. It's a 10 millimeter nut. You're going to loosen up and pull the cable off. Now you can pull the battery out and set this aside. At the bottom of the battery box is a wire loom clip to it. We need to pop that wire loom off using our panel popping tool here, because we need to get the battery box out of the vehicle to get the transmission mount out. So there's a couple 15 millimeter bolts here. These are part of the engine mount here, just below the battery box. Go ahead and remove those now. I'm using my impact tool to remove these. Now there's going to be three 10 millimeter bolts holding the battery box down. Mine were extremely rusty due to a battery leaking. So there's going to be a 10 millimeter bolt right here, one here, and then one further in the back. Now these were rounded out or rusted, so they were a lot smaller than the original ones, so I was having a lot of trouble. And the head of the bolts were covered up with a lot of dirt and rust and debris, so I used a little tool, a little screwdriver here, to pick around it and scrape as much of the debris away from the head of the bolt. That way I can get a socket on there and get this off. But my luck was not to be, so I got the debris blown out and got the head of the bolts more exposed, so I can get a ratchet on there with a socket and remove those fasteners. And since they were so rusty, I sprayed them down with penetrating oil. We used PB Blaster here at the shop. And since the bolts are so rounded, I'm using gear wrench bolt biter extractor bits. These are specially designed. These are half size down, so it's a 10 millimeter bolt, but it's rusted down smaller, so it's more like a 10 or 9.5 millimeter. So I put the minus size one on here, and this allows me to extract these bolts. So as far as bolt extractor sockets, these gear wrench ones I'm using here, called the bolt biter, are the best ones I've ever used. So if you're looking for bolt extractor sockets, I will leave links for it in the description of the video. These are well worth the money. So I got the first one out, and as you can see how rusty the bolt is, it's much smaller than the original size. And this bolt extractor here allowed me to get those out. These things grip really tight on rounded out fasteners and work amazingly. Most likely the reason why these bolts are so rusted out is because a battery at one point in time was leaking battery acid onto it, caused them to rust. So I got the first two bolts out with no problem, but there's a third bolt in the back that gave me a ton of problems. So the third bolt all the way in the back is recessed into a little hole back here. So I went ahead and filled it up with some penetrating oil. I tried the standard socket and ratchet first, but there was even less for it to bite on than the front two ones. So this one's much more decayed. So the head of the bolt in the very back here is almost rusted off, completely flush, and there's virtually nothing for the bolt extractor or sockets to grip onto. So we're gonna have to come up with a solution to get this box out. So I had to use a hole saw bit to cut around the head of the bolt and washer that's holding the air box down, or the battery box down, I should say. So my 90-degree drill is being out for warranty, so I had to use an impact socket, and I had to get creative and put a bolt through the hole saw here and use my impact wrench here with an impact socket to cut the hole around the bolt here. And the reason why we had to do that is because it's recessed into that hole and there's no room to chisel or drill or do anything in there. So we went ahead and cut a hole around the fastener, and that allowed us to get the battery box out and removed. Now I got it drilled out, I was able to pull it out, and as you can see here, what we had to cut around the head of the bolt here and cut this hole around it, and that allowed us to get it out. Since there's nothing for the socket to grab onto, we're going to cut a little slot into the head of the bolt here and then try to use a flat blade screwdriver to remove the fastener here. And to do that, I'm just using a straight die grinder with a cut-off wheel, and I'm just cutting a groove right down the center of that old bolt. Now I'm using a flat blade screwdriver socket on my ratchet here to put it into that slot and then see if I can get this bolt free. And luckily for me, the bolt came free. I was able to get this out. As I got the fastener removed here, you can see the battery hold down box, the plastic portion of it around the head of the bolt. That's what we cut with the hole saw. Now we can finish removing the transmission mount. There's two 15mm bolts or nuts on the back side that we're going to remove. Once you get the two nuts removed, you can remove this bracket that fits over the top of the transmission mount. Now we can remove the 18mm bolt going right through the center of the transmission mount. Go ahead and remove that. Once you get that removed, now you can lift the transmission mount up and out. Now you can go ahead and take your new transmission mount and put it into position. Then you can go ahead and start the 18mm nut. Once you got that started by hand, then you can take the metal bracket that went over the mount. You can go ahead and put that back on. Also, any of the wire looms that were clipped to that bracket, go ahead and reattach those. Once you got the bracket into position, go ahead and take the four 15mm nuts that went all over it and go ahead and start those, the two in the back and the two in the front. And then you can go ahead and just run those down until it's snug, and then we'll torque them down in a second. Now you can torque the four fasteners down to 59 foot-pounds. A tip for getting accurate torque is to not jerk the wrench or the ratchet, just to ease the pressure up to the torque. Now that the smaller bolts are torqued down, we can tighten up the center bolt here, the 18mm, run that down till it's snug. And now we're going to torque this down to 109 foot-pounds. So technically this battery box probably should be replaced, but we're not able to get one in a timely fashion for the customer to get the car back. So what we're going to use is these large fender washers to go down in the hole, and they'll clamp down just fine into the hole. There's just enough lip left of the box to hold it in there. So this will bolt it down in the back. That's the one we cut with the hole saw, and then the other two are fine. We'll just reuse new fasteners in the bolt holes. So now you can go ahead and reposition the battery box back into place and then start the three bolts that held it down. Once you get all three of the bolts started, then you can go ahead and just run them down until they're snug. Before I install the battery, I'm going to go ahead and clean up the battery cables here. They got a little bit of corrosion on them, so I'm going to put some battery cleaner on here and use a wire brush and clean those up. Now we can go ahead and put our battery back in. We want to make sure that the negative terminal is facing towards the rear of the vehicle. Go ahead and hook up the negative cable now and tighten that up, and then we can slide the battery underneath the cowling. Now you can put the battery hold down bracket on and then start the two 10mm nuts that held those on and tighten those down. Now we can take the positive cable and the battery end cap here and slide that back into the little groove that's on the front of the battery box here. So you'll look for those grooves on the left and right side and slide it into position. Once it's slid into position, then you can take the positive cable and go ahead and make sure that's all cleaned up and install it, tighten it up. When tightening these style battery clamps up, you don't want to go super tight on the bolt snaps off pretty easily. Just snug them up until they don't move anymore. Now you can clip the wire loom back into position that was on the front of the battery box. Also the one that was underneath here, you want to make sure that that's clipped back in. So you want to clip everything back in. Now we're ready to mount the lower air box. If you notice, there's these little tabs here, these little plastic little tabs. Now they mount into rubber grommets down here on the frame down here and on the battery box. So we're going to line those up and then press them down until they seat. So this can be a little tricky to line everything up, but you just kind of work the box in there, maneuver the wiring harness and stuff out of your way. And then once you get it all lined up, then you just press down until it fully seats. I also went ahead and put the air boot onto the mass airflow sensor here, so the snorkel goes onto the end of the mass airflow sensor. You can also go ahead and plug the mass airflow sensor back in. Once you got it plugged in, push the lock tab down and then put the wire loom back into place. Now you can go ahead and reinstall the air filter, so it just angles in there and plugs in, and then you got to make sure it lines up at the very back of the box. There's a little groove that the air filter slides into. Make sure that's in that groove. Now you can take the lid or the cover and we can go ahead and reinstall that. So we're going to position that over and then tighten up the 4 fasteners. Now at the front of the airbox was the air snorkel here. We're going to go ahead and reinstall that, line it up with the little grooves on the airbox and push it down into place. And then we'll take the rubber flap that held it in place, just pull it over and then hook it. Now that that's done, we can take the battery cover here and put it over the battery box and clip it on. Now that that cover is reinstalled, we can go ahead and take our floor jack and go ahead and remove that floor jack. Then you can go ahead and reinstall the shield. If your vehicle had it, go ahead and reinstall that. One other thing we're going to do is lower the vehicle back down, take it off the jack stands and put it back on the ground, and then go inside the vehicle and reset the clock. So the way we do that here is we push the menu button here. Once you see the menu button, you scroll down here until you see clock, hit the enter button in the center right here. Once you get that, then you can either use the keypad here, up or down or left or right, and then once you got it on the setting, you just hit OK and that resets the clock. And that's how the motor mount and transmission mounts are replaced on a Ford Focus. I'm Brian Esser from How To Automotive. I'd like to thank you guys for watching and encourage you to subscribe.